Alpha King took in a pregnant Omega girl sold by her husband. That's what set tongues wagging from the rail yard to the far canyon. Folks saw a towering cattle king ride her out of that auction yard, dust swirling, church bell tolling noon. But no one knew why he did it. Was it mercy? Or something older tied to land and blood? She came with nothing but the child in her belly and a past she wouldn't speak of. He ruled 3 valleys with a hard hand and a quiet code. Then came the whispers. Railroad men shifting boundary stones, riders seen near the high meadow, a husband returning sober and dangerous. When thundering hooves shake the ground and the wind carries the crack of a rifle, both will learn the truth. Some battles aren't for cattle or coin, they're for the right to keep a family together. Every story I share leads with love, for people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. The winter wind howled across the San Miguel cattle auction yard, whipping up clouds of dust that stung Clara Mae Dunn's eyes. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from both the biting cold and the humiliation burning through her chest. Her husband Pete, drunk and swaying, had dragged her here like livestock to be sold. "Who will give me the price of a good saddle for her?" Pete bellowed, his words slurring as he grabbed Clara's arm roughly. "She's young, she can cook, and she's carrying a child, too." The crowd of cowboys and ranchers erupted in cruel laughter. Clara felt her cheeks flame red as tears threatened to spill. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground, unable to meet the mocking stares of the men around her. Her hand instinctively moved to her slightly rounded belly, protecting the innocent life within. "Come on now," Pete continued, giving her a shake. "She ain't much to look at, but she works hard enough." More jeers and whistles filled the air. Clara wanted nothing more than to disappear into the dust swirling around them. How had her life come to this? Just months ago, she'd been a respectable farmer's wife, attending church on Sundays and keeping a tidy home. Now she stood in an auction yard, being sold like a piece of property by the man who had promised to love and protect her. The laughter suddenly died away, replaced by a heavy silence. Clara sensed a shift in the crowd and looked up to see the men parting like water around a stone. Through the gap strode the tallest man she'd ever seen. His broad shoulders seemed to block out the winter sun as he approached. Clara noticed his unusual features, high cheekbones and copper-toned skin that spoke of native blood, mixed with what appeared to be European ancestry. His black hair was longer than most white men wore theirs, tied back at his neck. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and intense, they seemed to see right through her. "Redstone," someone whispered in the crowd, and Clara saw several men take unconscious steps backward. The tall stranger, Redstone, stopped directly in front of Pete, who had to crane his neck to look up at him. Even in his drunken state, Pete seemed to shrink under that steady gaze. $1, Redstone said, his voice deep and quiet, yet carrying clearly across the now silent yard. He pulled a silver coin from his pocket and held it up, letting it catch the weak winter sunlight. Pete's face twisted in a mixture of fear and spite. "Now see here, Redstone." $1, Redstone repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "More than you deserve for such a disgrace." The coin flashed through the air. Pete caught it reflexively, then stood there looking foolish with his mouth hanging open. Clara noticed several onlookers nodding in approval at her husband's public shaming, though she didn't understand the undercurrent of old scores being settled that seemed to charge the air. Redstone turned to Clara, his expression unreadable. "Come," he said simply, extending a calloused hand to her. Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling fingers in his. Whatever waited for her with this stranger, it had to be better than remaining with Pete. Redstone's large hand was warm and steady as he led her through the parting crowd toward a magnificent sorrel gelding that stood waiting at the edge of the yard. Without a word, he lifted her onto the horse's back as easily as if she were a child, then swung up behind her. Clara sat stiffly, uncertain whether to lean back against his chest or try to maintain some distance. The decision was made for her as Redstone urged the horse forward with a gentle nudge of his heels, and she found herself pressed against him by the motion. They rode in silence, leaving San Miguel and its prying eyes behind. Clara wanted to ask where they were going, what he intended to do with her, but fear and shame kept her quiet. The winter landscape rolled by, brown grass, bare trees, and rocky outcrops dusted with patches of snow. As they crested a ridge late in the afternoon, Clara gasped despite herself. Below them stretched a vast ranch, easily the largest she'd ever seen. Fenced pastures spread out across the valley, dotted with cattle and horses. Several outbuildings clustered around a large main house, smoke curling from multiple chimneys. Redstone Ranch, her rescuer, or new owner, she wasn't sure which, said quietly. It was the first thing he'd spoken since leaving town. They rode down into the valley as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. By the time they reached the cluster of buildings, darkness was falling fast. Redstone reined the horse to a stop outside a long, low building that smelled of wood smoke and cooking. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Clara down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Redstone's strong hands steadied her, then quickly released her. "Miss Katie will feed you," he said, nodding toward the building's door. "You'll sleep in the loft above the kitchen tonight." Before Clara could respond, he turned and strode away into the gathering darkness, leaving her standing alone outside what she assumed must be the bunkhouse. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Warmth and light spilled out, along with the wonderful smell of beef stew. An older woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun looked up from a massive iron stove. "Well, come in then, girl, before you let all the heat out," she said briskly. "I'm Miss Katie. The boss said to expect you." Clara stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. The kitchen was large and well organized, with bunks visible in the room beyond. A narrow ladder in one corner led up to what must be the loft Redstone had mentioned. Miss Katie ladled out a generous bowl of stew and placed it on a small table, along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat," she commanded. "You're eating for two, from what I hear." Clara sank onto the bench, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening before Pete had started drinking and decided to drag her to the auction yard. As she ate, Miss Katie bustled around the kitchen, occasionally casting sharp glances her way, but asking no questions. When Clara finished, the older woman showed her up to the loft, providing a lantern and some worn but clean blankets. "It's not much," Miss Katie said, "but it's warm enough once the stove gets going. And it's safe here, girl. Whatever brought you to us, you're safe now." Clara waited until Miss Katie's footsteps had retreated down the ladder before letting her tears finally fall. She arranged the blankets on the straw-filled mattress and curled up beneath them, one hand resting protectively on her belly. The loft was cold despite Miss Katie's assurances, but Clara barely noticed. Her mind was too full of the day's events, Pete's final betrayal, the crowd's cruel laughter, and most of all, the mysterious man called Redstone who had saved her from public auction with a single silver dollar and an unspoken promise of sanctuary. As she drifted off to sleep, the sound of distant coyotes calling in the night mixed with the crackle of the kitchen stove below. Whatever tomorrow might bring, at least tonight she was safe, and that was more than she had had when the day began. Gray morning light filtered through the gaps in the loft boards, casting thin stripes across Clara's face. She blinked awake, her body stiff from sleeping on the unfamiliar mattress. For a moment she felt disoriented, then yesterday's events came rushing back, the auction yard, Pete's drunken shouting, and the tall stranger who had claimed her with a silver dollar. The aroma of fresh coffee and frying bread drifted up through the floorboards, making her stomach growl. Clara sat up slowly, pressing one hand against her lower back where the pregnancy made her muscles ache. She smoothed her wrinkled dress as best she could and plaited her hair before carefully descending the ladder. The kitchen was warm and busy, but different from the previous night. An older woman Clara hadn't met yet stood at the stove, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a clean apron over her dark dress and moved with practiced efficiency between the wood stove and work table. "Good morning," Clara said softly, hovering uncertainly by the ladder. The woman turned, fixing Clara with sharp blue eyes. "Mrs. Dwyer," she introduced herself curtly. "I run this kitchen." She studied Clara for a long moment, then gestured to a bench at the small side table. "Sit. You'll need breakfast if you're to work." Clara settled onto the bench, watching as Mrs. Dwyer placed a tin plate before her, loaded with golden fry bread and eggs. A steaming cup of coffee followed. The kitchen door opened, bringing a blast of cold air. Elijah Redstone stepped inside, looking different from yesterday. He was clean-shaven now, dressed in a fresh shirt with his coat already on and boots gleaming. His dark eyes found Clara at the table. "The rules here are simple," he said without preamble. "Everyone works for their keep, no exceptions." His tone wasn't unkind, but it left no room for argument. Clara straightened her spine. "I understand, Mr. Redstone. I'm not afraid of work." He nodded once. "Mrs. Dwyer will show you what needs doing." Without another word, he turned and strode out, leaving Clara alone with the stern-faced cook. "Well then," Mrs. Dwyer said, "start with those breakfast dishes once you've eaten." "There's always plenty to do in a ranch kitchen." Clara ate quickly, then rolled up her sleeves. She tackled the mountain of dishes with determination, scrubbing each pot and plate until it shone. When those were done, Mrs. Dwyer directed her to a basket of torn shirts from the bunkhouse. "Can you sew?" the older woman asked. "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me." "Good. These need mending before the men destroy them completely." Clara spent the morning with needle and thread, carefully repairing split seams and torn sleeves. The work was familiar and soothing, helping to settle her churning thoughts about what her future might hold here. Through the kitchen window, she watched Elijah ride out with several ranch hands, their figures growing smaller as they headed toward the distant fence lines. The winter sun climbed higher, glinting off patches of snow that still clung to the shadowed places. The day passed steadily in work. Clara's fingers stayed busy with mending while Mrs. Dwyer prepared the evening meal, the two women working in companionable silence. As sunset approached, the sound of horses in the yard drew Clara to the window. Elijah and his men had returned, two small calves draped across their saddles. The animals looked half frozen, likely separated from their mothers in the recent storm. Without thinking, Clara hurried to the door. "Bring them into the kitchen," she called out. "The stove's heat will help." The ranch hands glanced at Elijah, who gave a short nod. They carried the calves inside, laying them on old blankets near the stove. Clara knelt beside them, rubbing their cold limbs the way she'd learned growing up on her father's small farm. "They'll need warm milk," she said, looking up at Mrs. Dwyer. The cook was already reaching for a pot, her expression slightly softer than it had been all day. For the next hour, Clara tended the calves, warming milk and coaxing them to drink. Gradually, their shivering ceased and their eyes grew more alert. When she looked up again, she found Mrs. Dwyer watching her with what might have been approval. The bunkhouse filled as the sun set, ranch hands filing in for supper. They took their places at the long table, talking and laughing among themselves. Elijah sat apart at one end, his presence commanding respect even in silence. Clara helped serve the meal, then settled on a bench near the stove to shell beans for tomorrow's cooking. Without thinking, she began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had taught her. The familiar melody helped ease the ache of homesickness that had been building all day. She noticed Elijah's head tilt slightly in her direction, though he didn't look up from his plate. The wind picked up outside, rattling the eaves and reminding everyone of winter's persistent grip on the land. As the evening wore on, the ranch hands drifted off to their bunks or to the barn for final checks on the livestock. Clara gathered her mending supplies and prepared to climb back to her loft, but paused when she heard low voices from the corner. "Reckon the boss had his reasons for bringing her here," one cowhand murmured to another. "After what that Pete Dunn pulled with the Apache grazing lands years back?" "Hush up," his companion warned. "Ain't our business to speculate about the boss or his kin." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she climbed the ladder. The whispered conversation suggested there was more to her rescue than simple kindness, some old conflict between Elijah and Pete that she didn't understand. But what could her worthless husband have to do with Elijah's Apache relatives and their land? The wind continued to moan around the bunkhouse corners as Clara settled onto her mattress, her mind full of questions she wasn't sure she dared to ask. Snow fell silently through the night, blanketing Redstone Ranch in a fresh layer of white. Clara woke to find frost patterns etched across her small loft window, the morning sun turning them into delicate silver lace. Below in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of Mrs. Dwyer preparing breakfast echoed up through the floorboards. Clara dressed quickly, adding an extra shawl against the chill before descending the ladder. "Morning." Elijah's deep voice startled her as she reached the bottom rung. He stood near the doorway, already dressed in his heavy winter coat. "Once you've eaten, help Mrs. Dwyer with the root cellar inventory. We need to know what supplies will last until spring." "Yes, Mr. Redstone," Clara nodded, trying not to show how his presence affected her. Even after just 2 days at the ranch, something about his commanding presence made her heart beat faster. Mrs. Dwyer handed Clara a plate of hot porridge. "Eat up, girl. The cellar's cold work." After breakfast, Clara followed Mrs. Dwyer to the root cellar entrance, a heavy wooden door set into the hillside behind the bunkhouse. Inside, rows of shelves held preserved vegetables, dried herbs, and baskets of root vegetables packed in sand. "These need checking," Mrs. Dwyer pointed to a stack of woven baskets containing potatoes and turnips. "Any that are starting to spoil go to the hogs. The good ones need rinsing at the creek before being repacked." Clara worked steadily, sorting vegetables while Mrs. Dwyer tallied their inventory in a leather-bound notebook. The older woman's efficiency impressed her. Everything had its place and purpose here. By mid-morning, Clara had filled 2 baskets with vegetables that needed washing. The creek wasn't far, just past the barn where it curved through a snow-covered meadow. She balanced one basket on each hip, following the packed-down path through the fresh snow. The creek ran swift and clear despite the cold, its edges rimmed with ice. Clara knelt at a shallow spot, careful of her footing on the slippery rocks. As she began rinsing the vegetables, something metallic caught her eye upstream, an odd post sticking up through the snow. Curiosity drew her closer. Setting the basket safely on the bank, she picked her way carefully along the creek. The object was a survey marker, half buried in ice and snow. Clara brushed away the white powder, revealing carved initials. WPRR. Her heart quickened. Even with her limited education, she recognized those letters. Western Pacific Railroad Company. But what was their marker doing here on Redstone Ranch land? The sound of approaching horses made her freeze. 2 riders appeared on the opposite bank, their voices carrying clearly across the water. "Stone's buried good under this snow," one man said. "Come spring thaw, no one'll know we moved them." "Boss says this survey's got to hold up in court," the other replied. "Railroad's paying good money to push through here." Clara pressed herself behind a thick cottonwood trunk, hardly daring to breathe. The men continued upstream, their conversation fading into the winter stillness. Only when their horses' hoofbeats disappeared completely did she hurry back to her baskets. Her hands trembled as she finished washing the vegetables, mind racing. The men's words suggested something illegal, moving survey markers to alter property lines. She remembered the cowboys' whispered comments about Pete and land disputes with Elijah's Apache relatives. Was this connected? The rest of the day passed in a blur of work, but Clara couldn't shake her unease. At supper, she waited until most of the hands had left the table before approaching Elijah's end. He sat alone as usual, studying papers covered in numbers. "Mr. Redstone," she kept her voice low, "I saw something strange at the creek today. A survey marker with railroad initials, and there were men talking about moving stones before spring." Elijah's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. His dark eyes met hers, intense but unreadable. After a long moment, he simply said, "That meadow feeds half my herd come summer." The weight of unspoken meaning hung in his words. Clara wanted to ask more, but his expression warned against it. She nodded and withdrew to help Mrs. Dwyer with the evening cleanup. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Clara watched from her loft window as Elijah mounted his horse and rode out alone, his broad shoulders set with determination as he headed toward the high pasture. Something about his solitary figure disappearing into the vast white landscape made her chest tighten with worry. She pressed one hand against the cold glass, wondering what trouble was brewing beyond the snowy horizon. The survey marker and those mysterious riders felt like dark clouds gathering, threatening the peace she'd begun to find at Redstone Ranch. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Elijah's horse appeared on the snow-covered trail leading down from the high meadow. Clara spotted him from the chicken coop where she'd been gathering eggs. His broad shoulders were dusted with fresh snow, and even from a distance the grim set of his jaw told her the news wasn't good. She hurried to finish her tasks, carefully placing the eggs in their basket before heading toward the kitchen. Through the window, she watched Elijah dismount and hand his reins to one of the ranch hands. His usually steady movements seemed weighted with concern. Inside the warm kitchen, Mrs. Dwyer was kneading bread dough with quick, practiced motions. The older woman glanced up as Elijah entered, snow melting from his heavy coat. "You were right," he said directly to Clara, who stood near the hearth. "That marker you found isn't the only one. They've been shifting boundaries all along the upper grazing land. Railroads trying to claim it was always their territory." Clara set down her egg basket carefully. "How many markers did you find?" "5 so far, all moved from their original positions." Elijah's dark eyes flashed with contained anger. "That meadow's been Apache grazing land for generations before my father even built this ranch. Now the railroad wants to push their line through the heart of it." Mrs. Dwyer clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Sounds like you need the Reverend's counsel on this one, Mr. Redstone." Elijah nodded slowly. "Already sent word. Reverend Pike's riding in this evening." True to his word, just as the sun was setting, Reverend Josiah Pike arrived at the ranch. Clara had seen him briefly at church services in town, but never up close. He was a tall, lean man with kind eyes and silver threading through his dark hair. His weather-worn face spoke of years riding between scattered parishes across the territory. They gathered in the kitchen where Mrs. Dwyer had prepared a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee. Clara moved to leave them to their discussion, but Elijah's voice stopped her. "Stay," he said. "You found the first marker. You should hear this." Reverend Pike listened intently as Elijah explained the situation, his fingers laced around his coffee cup. When Elijah finished, the preacher was quiet for a long moment. "The railroad's got money and lawyers," he finally said, "but they don't have right on their side. We need proof, documents showing the original boundaries, witnesses who can testify to the marker's true positions." "That'll take time." Elijah's frustration was evident in his voice. "Time we might not have once spring comes and they start laying track." "Patience, Elijah." Reverend Pike's tone was gentle but firm. "Rush in with accusations and they'll bury you in paperwork and legal tricks. Gather your evidence first. Build your case carefully." Clara, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I could help more with the daily chores," she offered. "Free up time for you to ride out, document the marker's positions." Elijah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Over the next several days, Clara threw herself into ranch work with quiet determination. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Dwyer with breakfast, then moved through a growing list of tasks, mending torn saddle straps in the tack room, feeding chickens, hauling water from the well. Her hands grew calloused, but she worked without complaint. Each morning, Elijah rode out to survey more of his land, mapping the changed boundaries and gathering proof of the railroad's deception. Each evening, he returned with fresh anger etched in the lines around his mouth, but Clara noticed how his expression softened slightly when he saw the work she had accomplished in his absence. On the fourth evening, as Clara was finishing the dinner dishes, the sound of horses and unfamiliar voices drifted in from the yard. She peered out the window to see a small group of Navajo traders arriving, their pack horses laden with blankets and other goods. Without hesitation, Clara dried her hands and stepped out onto the porch. The traders were already dismounting, looking tired from their journey. She smiled warmly and gestured toward the kitchen. "Please come in where it's warm," she said. "We have coffee ready and there's still stew in the pot." The traders exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting such a welcome, but they smiled in return. The oldest among them, a woman with silver braids and laugh lines around her eyes, nodded appreciatively. From his position on the far end of the porch, Elijah watched the scene unfold. He'd seen how some white women treated native visitors with fear or disdain, but Clara showed neither. She moved easily among the traders, pouring coffee and listening intently as they discussed their goods. Finely woven blankets and strips of smoked venison. Mrs. Dwyer emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well," she said quietly to Elijah, "that girl's got a way about her, doesn't she? Makes folks feel at ease, no matter where they're from." Elijah nodded, watching as Clara admired a blanket's intricate pattern, while the silver-haired woman explained its meaning. In just a few days, she'd become a bridge between the different worlds that intersected at Redstone Ranch, the cowboys, the household staff, and now the native traders who regularly passed through. The trading party stayed for an hour, sharing coffee and conversation before continuing their journey. As they mounted up, the older woman pressed a small package wrapped in deerskin into Clara's hands, a gift of dried herbs and tea leaves. Clara's genuine delight in the gesture brought smiles to everyone's faces. After they'd ridden away, Clara turned to find Elijah still watching from the porch. Something had shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a thoughtful set to his mouth. He recognized now that this young woman he'd rescued from public humiliation was proving to be more than just another pair of hands on the ranch. She was helping him face the railroad threat, not just through her work, but by strengthening the bonds between all the people who called Redstone Ranch home. "Thank you," he said simply, "for all you're doing here." Clara ducked her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "This is my home now, too," she replied softly. "I want to help protect it." The evening settled around them, quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind in the pine trees. The ranch's lamplit windows glowed warmly against the gathering dusk, a beacon of hope against the challenges that lay ahead. The late March sun had begun to warm the valley, turning winter's frozen grip into rushing streams. Clara stood at the kitchen door, watching as the swollen creek tumbled past the ranch house, its waters brown and swift with snowmelt from the high country. "Clara," Elijah called from the barn, "we need to check the North Line shack. It'll be a full day's ride." She nodded, gathering her shawl and the packed lunch Mrs. Dwyer had prepared. The morning air still held winter's bite, but Clara had grown stronger during her months at Redstone Ranch, more capable of handling the demanding work each day brought. Elijah helped her mount the steady bay mare she'd been learning to ride. His own sorrel gelding stamped impatiently, eager to move. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, following a trail that wound through stands of pine and across open meadows where the snow had already retreated. The day warmed as they rode, and by midday they reached a gentle bend in the creek lined with willows. Elijah reined in, suggesting they rest the horses and eat. Clara spread their simple meal of bread, dried meat, and apples on a fallen log while the horses grazed nearby. "You should learn to shoot," Elijah said suddenly, studying her over the rim of his coffee cup. "There's too much trouble brewing to leave you defenseless." Clara's hands stilled on her bread. "I've never fired a gun before." "No better time to start." Elijah stood, retrieving his Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard. He walked her through the basics: how to load, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel. "Breathe steady," he instructed, standing close behind her as she aimed at a knot in a distant tree. "Squeeze the trigger slow, don't jerk it." The rifle's report echoed across the creek valley. Clara's shot went wide, but her second attempt chipped bark from the tree trunk. By her fifth shot, she was hitting near her target consistently. "Good," Elijah said, his usual reserve softening slightly. "Keep practicing whenever we can. I want you able to protect yourself if—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "If you're ever alone and need to." They continued north as afternoon shadows lengthened. The Lion Shack appeared just as dusk was settling, a simple one-room cabin built to shelter cowboys working the distant pastures. But something was wrong. The door hung askew, and the stovepipe jutted at an odd angle. Elijah dismounted quickly, drawing his revolver. "Stay with the horses," he told Clara, his voice low and hard. He approached the shack cautiously, pushing the door open with his boot. After a moment, he beckoned Clara forward. Inside, the small space had been ransacked. The cache of supplies was gone, food, ammunition, blankets all missing. The pot-bellied stove had been pushed over, its pipe deliberately bent. "Sabotage," Elijah said grimly, "making sure we can't maintain a presence up here when the spring work starts." They straightened what they could, but the shack was barely habitable. With night falling and the horses tired, they had no choice but to stay. They kept the fire low, not wanting to draw attention with too much smoke from the damaged pipe. Clara took one narrow bunk, Elijah the other, both fully clothed against the cold. Just before dawn, the soft thud of hooves brought them both awake. Elijah was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. "Stay here," he whispered to Clara. "Keep the rifle ready." He slipped out the door like a shadow. Clara's heart pounded as she waited, Winchester cradled in her arms just as he'd taught her. Minutes stretched eternal until she heard his boots on the porch again. But when Elijah returned, he wasn't alone. A small boy huddled against him, wrapped in Elijah's coat. The child's face was tear-streaked and dirty, his clothes worn thin. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "This is Mateo," Elijah said softly. "Found him hiding in the willows. His uncle was arrested at the agency, just left him there." Clara's heart clenched. She set aside the rifle and quickly unwrapped her wool shawl, moving slowly so as not to frighten the boy. "Here, little one," she said gently, draping it around his trembling shoulders. Mateo's dark eyes darted between them, wary as a wild thing, but he allowed Clara to guide him closer to the fire's remnants. She touched his cold hands, chafing them between her own. "We need to get him warm," she said to Elijah, "and fed." They had only a little bread left from their own provisions, but Mateo ate it slowly, carefully, as if unsure when he might see food again. Clara hummed softly as she worked tangles from his black hair, the same hymn she'd sung while shelling beans that first night in the ranch kitchen. Gradually, the boy's rigid posture relaxed. By the time they packed up to leave, he was staying close to Clara's side, one small hand clutching a fold of her skirt. "Can you ride?" Elijah asked him. When Mateo nodded, Elijah lifted him onto Clara's mare, settling him in front of her saddle. The ride back was slower. Mateo pressed against Clara for warmth and security. She kept one arm wrapped around him, the other holding the reins. Occasionally he would point to something, a hawk soaring overhead, a deer browsing in the distance, and whisper its name in Navajo. When they finally crested the ridge above Redstone Ranch, Clara felt Mateo tense. "It's all right," she murmured, hugging him closer. "You're safe here." Elijah rode slightly ahead, but Clara caught him glancing back at them more than once. Something had shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes when he watched her with the boy, a subtle easing of the constant vigilance he carried. The sun was setting as they rode into the ranch yard, painting the mountains gold and purple. Mrs. Dwyer hurried out of the kitchen, taking in the sight of the small boy with understanding in her weathered face. "Well now," she said briskly, "looks like we need a hot meal and a warm bath for our new guest." Clara helped Mateo down from the horse, keeping her shawl wrapped around his thin shoulders. He stayed close to her side as they walked toward the house, his small hand finding hers. She looked back once to see Elijah watching them from beside his horse, something unreadable but profound in his dark eyes. In that moment, as the day's last light gilded the ranch buildings and the distant peaks, Clara understood that family could mean more than blood. It could be built from broken pieces, from lost souls, finding shelter together against life's storms. The next morning dawned clear and cold at Redstone Ranch. Clara woke early, her thoughts immediately turning to their young guest. She found Mateo curled up in the kitchen near the bank stove, wrapped in the blankets Mrs. Dwyer had provided the night before. "Good morning, little one," Clara said softly, kneeling beside him. The boy's dark eyes opened, watching her carefully. Though he didn't speak, he sat up when she gestured toward the wash basin. Clara warmed water from the pump, adding it to the basin until it was comfortable. With gentle hands, she helped Mateo wash his face and hands, then worked the tangles from his black hair with a borrowed comb. His clothes were worn thin, but she managed to find a clean shirt that had shrunk in washing. Still too big, but better than what he wore. Mrs. Dwyer entered the kitchen as Clara was finishing, her usual stern expression softening at the sight of them. "Let me get that porridge started," she said, moving to the stove. "Boy needs a proper meal." While Mrs. Dwyer stirred the cooking porridge, Clara showed Mateo how to set the table, naming each item in English as they worked. "Spoon," she'd say, holding one up, and he'd repeat it carefully, then offer the Navajo word in return. When the porridge was ready, topped with honey and milk, Mateo ate slowly but steadily, as if still unsure when his next meal might come. Clara sat beside him, encouraging him to take seconds when his bowl was empty. "He'll need somewhere proper to sleep," Mrs. Dwyer observed, watching them. "Can't have him on the kitchen floor." "There's room in the loft," Clara suggested. "I can make him a bed up there near mine." After breakfast, Clara took Mateo up to the loft while Mrs. Dwyer began her daily baking. They found an extra bedroll tucked away in a corner, and Clara showed him how to arrange it neatly against the wall. The boy seemed to relax a little, having a space to call his own. Throughout the morning, Clara kept Mateo close as she did her chores, teaching him English words for everything they encountered. "Chicken," she'd say as they gathered eggs, or "water" as they pumped it for the kitchen. He was quick to learn, and his silent watchfulness began to give way to cautious smiles. Elijah had ridden out early to the Indian Agency, hoping to sort out Mateo's situation. He didn't return until late afternoon, his expression dark as thunderclouds as he strode into the kitchen where Clara was showing Mateo how to snap beans for supper. "The agency won't take responsibility for him," Elijah announced, his voice tight with frustration. "They've marked him as unplaced in their books. Said if we don't keep him, they'll likely send him east to one of those Indian schools." Clara's hands stilled on the beans. She looked at Mateo, who had tensed at Elijah's tone even though he couldn't understand all the words. "He can stay here," she said firmly. "I'll look after him." Elijah studied her for a long moment, then glanced at the boy. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard enough without taking on an orphan child." "He needs us," Clara said simply. "And we need him too, even if we don't know it yet." After a pause, Elijah nodded reluctantly. "All right, but he's your responsibility." Over the next week, a routine developed. Each morning, Clara and Mateo would help Mrs. Dwyer with breakfast, then move through their daily tasks together. The boy proved eager to learn and help, carrying kindling, feeding chickens, and following Clara everywhere like a shadow. Their language lessons continued, with Mateo's English improving daily. He began to speak more, sharing words from his own language in return. Clara learned to say "thank you" in Navajo, and "friend" and "home." One afternoon, Mateo found some long grass near the creek and showed Clara how to weave it into simple mats, his small fingers deft and sure. They sat in the weak spring sunshine, weaving together while he taught her the Navajo words for the colors they could see. The blue of the sky, the brown of the earth beginning to show through melting snow. Mrs. Dwyer's initial wariness had melted entirely. She began slipping Mateo extra pieces of fry bread, teaching him to help with the baking, and calling him dear when she thought no one was listening. Even the ranch hands grew used to seeing the small boy trailing after Clara, and would tip their hats to him like they would to any other member of the household. As the days passed, the last snow began to retreat from the valley. The creek ran fuller with meltwater, and tiny green shoots appeared in sheltered places. Clara spotted the first robin of the season one morning. showing Mateo its red breast and teaching him the English word for bird. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara sat in the rocking chair by the kitchen stove with Mateo drowsy in her lap. Without thinking, she began to sing softly, an old hymn her mother had sung to her. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Her clear voice filled the quiet kitchen, accompanied only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle creak of the rocking chair. Mateo's breathing grew steady and deep as he drifted toward sleep. Movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see Elijah standing in the doorway. He stood very still, watching them with an expression she'd never seen before, something tender and almost vulnerable crossing his usually stern features. For a moment, their eyes met over Mateo's sleeping form. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the small family they were becoming, unexpected but precious. Then Elijah nodded once and moved quietly away, leaving Clara to her song and the sleeping child in her arms. Outside, the last patches of snow continued to melt in the lengthening days, and the first hints of green began to color the distant pastures. Spring was stirring, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings for all of them. Spring arrived at Redstone Ranch with the familiar rhythms of branding season. The warming air filled with the scents of wet earth and fresh grass, and the sound of bawling calves echoed across the valley. Elijah gathered his crew early one morning, organizing the men into teams while the dew still sparkled on the grass. Clara rose before dawn to help Mrs. Dwyer prepare for the long days ahead. They worked side by side in the kitchen, packing beans, biscuits, and coffee for the men who would spend hours in the corrals. Mateo watched them with bright eyes, eager to be useful. "Would you like to help carry food to the men?" Clara asked him, and his face lit up with a nod. She showed him how to wrap the biscuits in clean cloth, teaching him the English words as they worked. "Hot," she warned, helping him handle the coffee pot carefully. The branding corrals buzzed with activity. Cowboys on horseback separated calves from their mothers, while others worked the branding irons and vaccination supplies. The air filled with dust and smoke from the fire heating the irons. Mateo trotted between the cook fire and the working men, carefully balancing plates and cups. The cowboys smiled at his serious expression as he delivered their meals, some teaching him simple words in Spanish or English. He seemed to grow taller with each trip, proud to be trusted with such important work. Clara kept the coffee hot and the food coming, her skirts swishing through the spring grass as she moved between the kitchen and the corrals. She watched the branding with interest, learning the rhythm of the work. The men's initial awkwardness around her had faded into a kind of careful respect, though they still kept their distance. Near midday, dark clouds rolled in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of rain. Elijah called for the men to work faster, trying to finish the current group of calves before the storm hit. The first fat drops were just beginning to fall when Clara heard a splash and a frightened bawl. A young calf, spooked by thunder, had slipped down the muddy bank into the creek. The water, swollen with spring runoff, tugged at its legs. Without hesitation, Clara hitched up her skirts and waded into the cold water. The current pulled at her legs, but she pressed forward, reaching for the struggling calf. Her hands found purchase on its wet hide, and she lifted, muscles straining. "Hold on, Mrs. Dunn," one of the cowboys called, splashing in to help. Together, they managed to boost the calf onto the bank, where it stumbled to its feet and ran bleeding to its mother. The rain fell harder now, plastering Clara's hair to her face and soaking her clothes. But she smiled, satisfied with the rescue. Looking up, she saw the cowboys watching her with new eyes, not as some delicate flower thrust into their midst, but as someone who could hold her own when needed. Elijah appeared at her side, offering his coat. "That was well done," he said quietly, helping her from the creek. His hand lingered on her arm a moment longer than necessary. The downpour forced them to pause the branding. The crew gathered in the bunkhouse, where a fire blazed in the stone hearth. Mrs. Dwyer sent over hot coffee and fresh cornbread, and the men's spirits rose with the warmth and food. Clara changed into dry clothes and joined them, Mateo close beside her. To her surprise, Elijah took a seat next to her on the rough-hewn bench. It was the first time he'd sat so near since bringing her to the ranch. The cowboys shared stories as they ate, their usual reserve melting away. They spoke of other brandings, of cattle drives and storms weathered, including Clara in their tales as if she'd earned the right to hear them. She found herself laughing at their jokes, offering her own small observations about ranch life that drew appreciative nods. Elijah remained quiet beside her, but it was a comfortable silence. She noticed how he'd positioned himself so his broad shoulders blocked the draft from the door, keeping her and Mateo warm. When she passed him the cornbread, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away too quickly. As the rain began to ease, the men drifted back to their work. Clara gathered empty cups and plates, preparing to return to the kitchen. Mateo had fallen asleep on a pile of saddle blankets, worn out from his morning's efforts. She found Elijah waiting by the bunkhouse door. The others had already gone ahead, leaving them in a moment of privacy. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his deep voice soft. "Not just for the calf, for everything you've done here." His eyes met hers, and something shifted in their depths. "You've brought changes to this ranch? Good ones." Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm grateful for the chance you gave me," she replied. "This place, it's becoming home." Elijah nodded, and for a moment it seemed he might say more, but thunder rolled across the valley, reminder of nature's power and the work still waiting. He stepped back, touching his hat brim in a gesture that carried more meaning than usual. Clara gathered sleeping Mateo in her arms and headed for the kitchen, feeling Elijah's gaze follow her across the yard. The air smelled of rain and smoke and possibility, while distant thunder echoed off the hills. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with spring birds calling from the cottonwoods. Clara stood at the kitchen window, kneading dough for the morning's biscuits, while Mateo sat cross-legged nearby, sorting dried beans. The peaceful scene shattered as the sharp rhythm of multiple horses' hooves thundered into the yard. Clara's hands froze in the dough. Through the window, she watched 5 riders approach, and her heart stopped when she recognized the lean figure in front. Pete Dunn sat straight-backed in his saddle, wearing a clean shirt and looking more sober than she'd seen him in months. 2 hard-faced men in city clothes flanked him, their guns visible on their hips. Behind them rode the county sheriff and his deputy. "No," she whispered, flour-covered hands pressing against her apron. "No, no." Mateo sensed her fear and pressed close to her skirts, his small fingers gripping the rough fabric. Through the open window, they heard boots hitting dirt as the men dismounted. Elijah emerged from the barn, his stance wary but controlled. He moved deliberately, positioning himself between the approaching men and the kitchen door where Clara stood frozen. "Dunn," Elijah's voice carried clearly across the yard. "You're not welcome here." Pete's familiar smirk spread across his face. "Now, that ain't for you to decide, Redstone. I've come for what's legally mine." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "My wife, Clara May Dunn." The sheriff stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Redstone, I've got legal documents here showing Mrs. Dunn is still lawfully married. That transaction at the auction yard holds no legal weight." Clara's legs weakened and she gripped the window frame. The memory of that humiliating day flooded back, Pete, drunk and cruel, trying to sell her like cattle. But now he stood there, cleaned up and backed by the law, reaching for her with greedy hands once more. "You can't have her," Mateo burst out, darting toward the door. Clara caught him just in time, pulling him back into the safety of the kitchen. Pete's eyes narrowed at the boy's outburst. "Keeping Indian strays now, are you, Redstone? Fitting company for a man of your background?" Elijah's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady. "Clara's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Look here, the law's clear on this. A husband has rights to his wife and her unborn child. You can't just buy a married woman, no matter what her fool husband said while in his cups." One of the railroad men stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "The railroad has interest in seeing this matter settled proper and legal-like. Mrs. Dunn should return to her lawful husband." Clara's hand moved protectively to her growing belly. Of course, Pete had found new backers. The railroad wanted Elijah's land, and now they were using her to pressure him. Reverend Pike's wagon appeared on the road, his arrival momentarily drawing all eyes. He assessed the situation quickly as he pulled up, climbing down with his Bible in hand. "Perhaps we might discuss this like civilized folk," the Reverend suggested, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Sheriff, surely you can give everyone time to review the situation properly?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "I can give you until tomorrow noon. But then either Mrs. Dunn comes willingly, or I'll have to enforce the law." He touched his hat brim. "I'm sorry, Mr. Redstone, I truly am." Pete's smirk widened. "Hear that, Clara May? Best pack your things. We're heading to a fine new place. Railroad's setting me up real nice." Clara stepped onto the porch, steel in her spine despite her fear. "I'll die before I go back to you, Pete Dunn." "Now, Clara," Pete's voice turned silky, dangerous. "That's no way for a Christian wife to talk. Think of the baby. Would you want it born a bastard?" Elijah moved like lightning, his hand catching Pete's shirt front, before anyone could blink. One more word about her or the child, and they'll never find all the pieces of you. The railroad men reached for their guns, but Reverend Pike stepped between them. Enough. Sheriff, you've given us until tomorrow. I suggest everyone take this time to cool their heads and pray on what's right. The sheriff nodded gratefully at the Reverend's intervention. Come on, boys. We'll camp in town tonight. He looked at Clara with genuine sympathy. I truly hope you'll choose to come peaceful tomorrow, Mrs. Dunn. I don't want trouble here. Elijah released Pete, who straightened his shirt with exaggerated care. Tomorrow then, Clara May. Best say your goodbyes to this half-breed and his pet Indian. The men mounted up and rode out, Pete's mocking laughter floating behind them. Clara waited until they were out of sight before her legs gave way. Elijah caught her before she could fall, his strong arms steady around her. I won't go back to him, she whispered fiercely. I'll run if I have to. Reverend Pike joined them on the porch, his weathered face grave. Let's take this inside and talk it through properly. In the kitchen, Mrs. Dwyer silently poured coffee while Mateo huddled close to Clara's side. Elijah paced the length of the room while Reverend Pike examined Pete's legal documents. The law is on his side, the Reverend admitted heavily. In the territory's eyes, you're still his wife, Clara. The auction yard incident holds no legal standing. The law? Elijah's voice was quiet but filled with barely contained fury. The law that lets a man sell his wife like cattle, then claim her back when it suits him? The law that lets the railroad steal land and buy men's souls? I know it's not right, Reverend Pike said, but if we defy the sheriff openly, there will be bloodshed. The railroad men made that clear enough. Clara looked up from where she'd been stroking Mateo's hair. I won't be the cause of violence here, but I also won't go back to that man. There must be another way. Elijah stopped his pacing to look at her, something fierce and protective in his gaze. I made you a promise when I took you from that auction yard. I won't let him take you. The railroad's behind this, Reverend Pike mused. They're using Pete to pressure you, Elijah. They think if they can force Clara to leave, you'll be more likely to sell. Mateo suddenly spoke up, his voice small but determined. We could hide. I know places in the hills where they'd never find us. Clara hugged the boy close, touched by his loyalty. The room fell silent as darkness gathered outside, each person lost in their own thoughts. The sound of coyotes calling in the distance seemed to underscore their precarious situation. I need your word, Clara finally said, looking directly at Elijah. Promise me, whatever happens tomorrow, you won't let Pete take me back. Elijah met her gaze, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of deeper feelings neither had yet voiced. I promise, he said simply, whatever it takes. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold when Elijah strode into the kitchen, his face set with determination. Clara looked up from where she was hurriedly packing bread and dried meat into a cloth bundle, Mateo hovering close by her side. Thomas will take you and the boy to Reverend Pike's, Elijah said, nodding toward the ranch foreman waiting outside. Stay there until I come for you. Clara's fingers trembled as she tied the bundle. What about you? I'm heading to town. The land office opens at 8 o'clock. There's something not right about those papers Pete showed yesterday. Elijah's voice was grim. I aim to find out what... Mateo clutched Clara's skirts. I don't want to go. Elijah knelt before the boy, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. I need you to be brave, little one. Stay close to Clara. Keep her safe for me. The boy straightened, pride flickering across his face at being given such an important task. Clara gathered their few belongings while Thomas brought the wagon around. The morning air bit cold and sharp as they climbed aboard. Elijah helped Clara up, his hand lingering on hers. Whatever happens, remember my promise. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Thomas clicked to the horses and they set off down the rutted road, Elijah's tall figure growing smaller behind them. The morning stretched long as they traveled, taking back trails to avoid the main road. Thomas kept the team moving at a steady pace, his weather-worn face scanning the horizon. They passed several railroad camps in the distance, smoke rising from morning fires. Keep your head down when we pass the next ridge, Thomas warned. There's been strange riders about lately. Clara pulled Mateo closer, drawing her shawl over both their heads. The wagon creaked through a narrow valley, cottonwoods casting dappled shadows across their path. Every snapping twig made her jump. Just past noon, they stopped briefly to water the horses at a shallow creek. Clara helped Mateo drink, then retrieved their bundle of food. They ate quickly, speaking in whispers. The trouble came swift and sudden in the mid-afternoon. They were passing through a stretch of scrub oak when 3 riders appeared ahead, blocking the narrow trail. Clara's heart stopped as she recognized Pete's lean figure in the center, flanked by the railroad men from yesterday. "Thomas," she breathed in warning, but he had already seen them. The foreman reached for his rifle, but one of the railroad men was faster. The shot cracked across the quiet afternoon, catching Thomas in the shoulder. He tumbled from the wagon seat with a cry of pain. "Now, now," Pete drawled, urging his horse forward. "No need for anyone else to get hurt. Clara May, you just come along quiet-like." "Run, Mateo," Clara whispered urgently, pushing the boy toward the back of the wagon. He slipped over the side and disappeared into the brush like a shadow. Pete's eyes narrowed. "Get that Indian brat!" But the railroad men were more interested in Clara. They approached from both sides, leaving her nowhere to go. Rough hands grabbed her arms, dragging her from the wagon despite her struggles. "No," she screamed, kicking out as they lifted her toward Pete's waiting wagon. "Let me go?" Pete laughed, the sound cold and familiar. "Still got that spirit, I see. Don't worry, wife. We'll fix that soon enough." They threw her into the wagon bed where Pete quickly bound her wrists with rope. Thomas lay in the dust, clutching his bleeding shoulder, unable to help. "Leave the old man," Pete ordered. "He won't make it far anyway." He turned his wagon around, the railroad men falling in behind. "Time to show you your new home, Clara May. Railroad's given me a fine piece of land. Once Redstone signs his over, that is." Clara twisted against the ropes, watching helplessly as Thomas and the abandoned wagon grew distant. Somewhere in the brush, she prayed Mateo was safe, running back to warn Elijah. The afternoon sun beat down as they traveled higher into the canyon, the wagon jolting over rocky ground. Clara's wrists burned from the rope, but she kept working at the knots, refusing to give up. Miles away, Elijah was already riding hard toward home, his mind churning with what he'd learned in town. The land office records showed tampering, dates changed, boundaries shifted. Proof of the railroad's schemes, but would it be enough? He was still 2 miles from the ranch when he spotted a rider approaching at a gallop. As they drew closer, he recognized Thomas, slumped over his saddle, shirt dark with blood. "Boss," Thomas gasped as Elijah helped him down. "Pete Dunn ambushed us. Took Clara. Where's Mateo? Ran into the brush when they attacked." Thomas winced, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "They're heading up canyon." Elijah's face hardened. "Can you make it to the ranch?" Thomas nodded weakly. "Go. Find her." Without another word, Elijah swung back into his saddle. He studied the ground, quickly finding the wagon tracks leading toward the high canyon. His Apache mother had taught him tracking from childhood. Every broken twig and scattered stone told a story. The tracks were clear in the rocky soil, the wagon moving fast but careless. Pete was cocky, not bothering to hide his trail. That would be his mistake. As Elijah followed the signs higher into the canyon, his thoughts turned dark. Pete had gone too far this time. The railroad might own the law in town, but up here, in the wild places, older rules held sway. A flash of movement caught his eye, small, quick, darting between boulders. He reined in, recognizing the familiar shape. "Mateo?" The boy emerged from hiding, tears streaking his dusty face. "They took her." "I couldn't stop them." "You did right, running for help," Elijah assured him, reaching down to pull the boy up behind him. "Did you see which way they went?" Mateo pointed toward a narrow gap between towering rock walls. "Up there. Pete said something about a new place." Elijah nodded grimly. He knew the spot, an abandoned mining camp the railroad had claimed. The perfect place to hide someone until their demands were met. "Hold tight," he told Mateo, turning his horse toward the gap. The sun was lowering, painting the canyon walls in deep shadows. Soon it would be dark, but Elijah didn't slow. He could read this land by starlight if needed. Clara's face filled his mind. Her quiet strength, her gentle ways with Mateo, the trust in her eyes when she'd asked for his promise. He'd meant every word. Pete Dunn would never lay hands on her again. The wagon tracks led on, winding higher into the gathering dusk. Elijah pushed his horse hard through the afternoon, following the wagon's clear trail up into the canyon. The tracks told their own story. Pete's group was moving fast but careless, confident no one would follow. Their hubris would work in his favor. As dusk painted the canyon walls in deep purple shadows, Elijah spotted a small figure crouched behind a granite boulder. His hand moved toward his rifle until he recognized the familiar shape. "Mateo," he called softly, relief flooding his voice. The boy emerged from his hiding spot, chest heaving from running. His clothes were torn from pushing through brush, but his eyes were bright with determination. He had tracked parallel to Pete's wagon for miles, staying hidden while keeping them in sight. They stopped 2 miles ahead, Mateo reported between breaths, near the big rock that looks like a sleeping bear. Elijah dismounted, leading his horse off the trail. "Show me what you found, but first you need to rest and eat." They made a cold camp in a small hollow, sheltered by twisted juniper trees. No fire that might give away their position. Elijah shared the last biscuits from his saddlebag, watching as Mateo devoured his portion. The boy had shown remarkable courage and skill today. "Tell me everything you saw," Elijah said quietly as they ate. Mateo described Pete's camp in detail: 3 men, 2 horses, and the wagon positioned beneath a rock overhang. They tied Clara's hands, but she keeps working at the ropes when they're not looking. Pride crept into his voice. "She's brave, like you said we should be." "That she is." Elijah's jaw tightened, thinking of Clara bound and afraid. But she wasn't giving up, and neither would he. They rested until false dawn, when the sky began to lighten behind the eastern peaks. Mateo led the way, moving as silent as a shadow through the rocks. The boy had learned well from his Navajo kin. When they reached a ridge overlooking Pete's camp, Elijah studied the scene through narrowed eyes. The wagon sat beneath a natural stone overhang, offering shelter but also blocking escape from behind. 2 men slept rolled in blankets near a dead fire. The third man, Pete himself, found propped against a wheel, rifle across his knees. Clara lay in the wagon bed, her bound hands visible in the growing light. Elijah counted 3 rifles within easy reach of the sleeping men. A direct attack would be suicide. He needed a different strategy. "Their horses are hobbled over there," Mateo whispered, pointing to where 3 mounts grazed in a patch of sparse grass. "I could sneak down and set them loose." Elijah considered the boy's offer. Horses running wild would certainly create a distraction, but it was risky. "It's dangerous. If they spot you—" "I can do it," Mateo insisted. "I'm small and quiet. They won't see me in the shadows." Looking at the determined set of the boy's jaw, Elijah saw the same quiet strength he'd noticed in Clara. These 2 had become more than just people under his protection. They were becoming family. "All right," he agreed finally, "but wait for my signal. When you hear an owl call, that's when you move. Not before." Mateo nodded solemnly, already plotting his path down the rocky slope. Elijah gripped his shoulder. "Be careful, little brother. Clara would never forgive me if something happened to you." The boy's eyes shone at being called brother. He melted into the pre-dawn shadows, barely disturbing a pebble as he went. Elijah positioned himself behind a boulder with a clear view of the camp, his Winchester ready but not yet aimed. Violence would be his last resort. He'd seen too much bloodshed in his life already. The sky continued to brighten as he waited, watching Pete's men stir and stretch. One built up the fire while the other checked on Clara. Elijah's hands tightened on his rifle when the man roughly pulled her to a sitting position, but she held herself with dignity despite her bonds. Pete stood, stretching dramatically. "Best get moving soon. Long ride ahead to our new home, wife?" "I'm not your wife anymore." Clara's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "You sold that right for a silver dollar." Pete's hand rose as if to strike her, but he caught himself laughing instead. "Still got that spirit. Don't worry, that'll change once we're settled on our new land. Railroads promised me a fine piece of Redstone's grazing ground. Once he signs it over to save you, that is." So that was their game. Use Clara to force his hand with the land dispute. Elijah's lip curled in disgust. Pete hadn't changed, still trying to profit from others' pain. The sun crested the canyon rim, throwing long shadows across the camp. Perfect cover for what he planned. Elijah lifted his head and made the call. 3 short hoots of an owl, natural enough to avoid suspicion but clear to Mateo's waiting ears. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Then a shadow detached itself from the rocks, creeping toward the hobbled horses. Elijah held his breath, watching Mateo work. The boy's small hands moved surely on the ropes, loosening knots with careful patience. One of Pete's men stood, stretching. "Something spooked the horses? They seem restless." "Probably just a rabbit," Pete dismissed. "Get the fire built up. I want coffee before we ride." The horses shifted nervously as Mateo worked on the last hobble. One stamped its foot, tossing its head. The second man looked up, frowning. "Hey, there's something." Before he could finish, Mateo slapped the nearest horse hard on its flank. The animal reared with a startled whinny, breaking free. The other horses followed, panicked by their companion's fear. In moments, all three mounts were plunging away from camp, kicking up dust and stones. "The horses!" Pete shouted. "Get after them!" His men scrambled for their rifles, but the weapons would be useless against fleeing horses. They had to chase them down on foot or lose their only transportation. Elijah watched from his position, muscles coiled and ready. The moment to act was coming, but not quite yet. First, let confusion do its work. The two railroad men pounded after the horses, leaving Pete alone with Clara. Just as Elijah had hoped. A fair fight now. One man against one, with Clara's freedom hanging in the balance. Mateo had vanished back into the rocks, his part played perfectly. Now it was Elijah's turn to move. He rose from behind the boulder, rifle ready but not yet raised. "Morning, Pete," he called clearly. "I believe you have something that belongs to me?" The sun climbed high overhead as Elijah emerged from his cover, rifle held loose and unthreatening at his side. Each step was measured and deliberate as he approached the camp, his boots crunching softly on the rocky ground. The morning air had warmed, but tension made it feel sharp as winter. Clara sat rigid in the wagon, her bound hands clutched tightly in her lap. Her eyes widened at his appearance, a mix of hope and fear crossing her face. Pete stood near the dead campfire, his own rifle propped against the wagon wheel within easy reach. "Mighty bold of you to walk right in," Pete called out, a mocking edge to his voice. "Come to watch me ride off with what's mine?" "Nothing here belongs to you anymore, Pete." Elijah's voice carried clearly across the space between them, steady and controlled. "But I'm willing to make a trade." Pete barked out a laugh. "Trade? What could you offer that's worth more than railroad land?" "My best mare." Elijah kept his tone even, reasonable. "Blood bay with 4 white socks, worth more than any 3 regular horses. She's yours, in exchange for Clara's freedom." "Your prized mare?" Pete's eyes narrowed with interest despite himself. Everyone in the territory knew the value of Elijah's horses. "And what's to stop me from just taking her later? Because you know what would happen if you tried." Elijah took another step forward, his presence filling the small camp. "This ends today, Pete, one way or another." Clara watched the exchange intently, her fingers working at her bonds behind her back. The morning sun cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. A sudden shout from above cut through their standoff. All eyes turned to the canyon rim where dark shapes appeared against the bright sky. Riders materialized along the edge, their forms growing distinct as they moved down the slope with practiced ease. Leading them was a tall figure Elijah knew well, his mother's cousin, Strong Bear, and behind him rode 6 Apache warriors, their weapons ready but not yet drawn. Pete's face drained of color. "You brought them into this?" His hand twitched toward his rifle. "They brought themselves," Elijah replied calmly. "These are my mother's people. This is their land too." The Apache riders spread out along the ridge, effectively surrounding the camp. Their presence shifted the air itself, like storm clouds gathering before rain. Strong Bear raised his hand in greeting to Elijah, his face stern as he surveyed the scene. Pete's bravado crumbled slightly. The railroad won't stand for Apache interference. They have papers, Dash. "Papers can lie," Elijah cut him off, "but the truth is written in the land itself." He took another step forward, then did something unexpected. He slowly lowered his rifle to the ground. The weapon made a soft thud as it settled in the dust. Clara gasped softly at this deliberate show of vulnerability. Even Pete looked confused by the gesture. "I could end this with violence," Elijah continued, his voice carrying to everyone present. "But I choose mercy instead. Not for your sake, Pete, but for my own soul's peace, and for Clara's." He straightened, hands empty at his sides. "But understand this, if you harm her, you'll answer to both Apache justice and God's judgment. Choose carefully." The morning silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Pete's eyes darted between Elijah's calm face and the watching Apache warriors. His hand still hovered near his rifle, but uncertainty had crept into his stance. A sudden commotion broke the tension, the thunder of hooves and alarm shouts from Pete's men in the distance. Mateo had led their horses even further away, scattering them across the canyon. The boy's clever distraction had worked perfectly. Pete's resolve finally broke. Without his men or horses, surrounded by Apache warriors, his situation had become untenable. He snatched up his rifle and backed away from the wagon. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice shook slightly. "The railroad—" "We'll find other land," Elijah finished firmly. "Go, Pete, while you still can." For a moment, Pete looked like he might argue further. Then Strong Bear's horse shifted, hooves striking sparks from the rocks, and Pete's courage failed entirely. He turned and fled, scrambling over the loose stones toward where his men had disappeared. The moment he was gone, Clara struggled to her feet in the wagon. Elijah crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, lifting her down with gentle hands. She practically fell against his chest as he quickly untied her bonds. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, breathless but steady. Her fingers clutched his shirt front. "I kept faith." "You were very brave," he murmured, checking her wrists for rope burns. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then looked up at the Apache riders who still watched from their positions. "Your family?" "Yes." Elijah turned slightly, raising his hand in thanks to Strong Bear. His cousin nodded gravely in return, then gestured to his warriors. As silently as they had appeared, the Apache riders melted away into the morning shadows, leaving Elijah and Clara alone in the abandoned camp. Mateo appeared from behind a boulder, grinning proudly. "Did you see? I led the horses way out into the canyon." Clara laughed, the sound bright with relief, and held out her arms. The boy ran to her, accepting her fierce hug. "You were wonderful," she told him, "so brave and clever." Elijah watched them embrace, something warm unfurling in his chest. Then he retrieved his rifle and surveyed the scattered camp. "We should head back to the ranch. There's work waiting, and Mrs. Dwyer will be worried." Clara nodded, keeping one arm around Mateo's shoulders. The morning sun painted the canyon in shades of gold and rose, the danger passing like shadows before dawn. They had won this battle without bloodshed, through wisdom, courage, and the strength of family bonds both old and new. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they rode away from the canyon, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust along the worn trail. Clara sat tall in her saddle despite her ordeal, with Mateo perched securely in front of her. Elijah led them along a winding path that followed a spring-fed creek, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. After an hour's ride, they approached a small army survey post, little more than a weathered cabin with a flagpole marking its official status. A young lieutenant stood on the porch, raising his hand in greeting as they drew near. "Mr. Redstone," the officer called out, recognition clear in his voice. "Fortuitous timing. I've just returned from the canyon myself." Elijah reined his horse to a stop, his expression curious. "Lieutenant Parker, what brings you out this way?" The lieutenant stepped down from the porch, adjusting his blue uniform coat. "Was checking boundary markers when I overheard quite the interesting conversation." He glanced at Clara and Mateo before continuing. "That fellow Dunn and his railroad friends were mighty loose with their tongues during their retreat, boasting about moving survey stones, if you can believe it." Clara's breath caught audibly. Elijah sat straighter in his saddle, his eyes intent. "You witnessed this yourself?" "Clear as day," Lieutenant Parker confirmed. "They were in quite a state after their encounter with you, sir. Didn't even notice me taking notes." He patted the leather satchel at his hip. "I'm preparing an official report on the tampering. The Army takes a dim view of altering federal survey markers." Relief washed over Elijah's features, though he maintained his composed demeanor. "I'd be grateful if you'd file that report promptly, Lieutenant." "Already drafted, sir. This should put an end to their land grab schemes." The officer gestured toward the cabin's water pump. "Please help yourselves. You look like you've had a long morning." They dismounted gratefully, letting the horses drink while they filled their own canteens. Clara helped Mateo wash the dust from his face, her movements gentle despite her obvious fatigue. Elijah and the lieutenant spoke quietly near the porch, discussing details for the report. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Parker shook Elijah's hand firmly. "Justice will be served this time, Mr. Redstone. The railroad can't argue with Army testimony." Elijah nodded his thanks, understanding the full weight of this unexpected gift. The railroad's legal claim would crumble once the tampering was officially documented. His land, and his people's grazing rights, were finally secure. They rode until sunset, finding a sheltered hollow near a stand of cottonwoods to make camp. After settling the horses, Elijah built a small fire while Clara shared out their remaining bread. Mateo fell asleep almost immediately, curled in Clara's shawl near the warmth of the flames. The night air grew cool as they sat together, sharing coffee from Elijah's battered tin pot. Stars emerged above them, brilliant in the clear spring sky. Clara wrapped her arms around her knees, her voice soft in the darkness. "I was so afraid I'd never see the ranch again," she admitted. "Never see the kitchen garden I'd started planning, or find out if Mrs. Dwyer would ever truly accept me." She paused, then added quietly, "Never see you ride in at sunset again?" Elijah was silent for a long moment, watching the fires dance. When he spoke, his deep voice carried an emotion she'd never heard before. "I feared losing more than land today." He met her eyes across the flames. "When I saw them taking you away, I realized what truly mattered." Something shifted between them in that moment, a quiet understanding deeper than words. Clara's hand found his across the space between them, and their fingers interlocked naturally, as if they'd always been meant to fit together this way. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn low, while Mateo slept peacefully beside them. The stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to this new closeness, this tentative bridge being built between two hearts that had found each other against all odds. The summer sun painted Redstone Ranch in vibrant shades of green and gold. Tall grass swayed in the warm breeze across the disputed meadows, now securely under Elijah's stewardship after the Army's investigation had confirmed the railroad's wrongdoing. The land flourished under careful management, dotted with fat cattle grazing contentedly in the summer abundance. Near the corral, 7-year-old Mateo's determined face scrunched in concentration as he swung his small practice rope. Under the patient guidance of the ranch hands, he'd learned to loop the rope around still posts, then moving targets, and now attempted to catch younger calves. His happy shouts of success echoed across the yard whenever he managed a clean throw. Clara watched from the kitchen porch, one hand resting on her growing belly. 5 months along now, her pregnancy showed clearly beneath her apron. She'd taken to wearing looser dresses, sewn from fabric Mrs. Dwyer had helped her order from the general store. The older woman had become something of a mother figure, their initial wariness replaced by genuine affection. Reverend Josiah Pike made regular visits to the ranch, noting the changes with quiet approval. During one such afternoon call, he observed Elijah helping Clara down the porch steps, the rancher's normally stern face softening with concern for her comfort. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the Reverend commented later to Mrs. Dwyer. Who would have thought that auction yard scandal would lead to such blessing? On a particularly fine evening in late June, after the day's work was done, Elijah found Clara in the kitchen. Lamplight cast a warm glow over the familiar space where their relationship had first begun to grow. She stood at the wooden table, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. "Clara?" he said softly, causing her to look up. His eyes held an intensity she'd never seen before. "These past months, you've brought life to this ranch in ways I never expected, not just with your work, but with your heart." He stepped closer, taking her flour-dusted hands in his. "I'm asking you proper now. Will you marry me? Not from duty, but because I love you." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she laughed, joy illuminating her face. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes!" The ranch erupted into celebration when they announced their engagement. The cowhands immediately began planning, arguing good-naturedly over who would build the best benches for the ceremony. Within days, their Navajo trading partners arrived with beautiful hand-woven blankets as engagement gifts, the intricate patterns telling stories of harmony and blessing. The kitchen that had once been Clara's lonely refuge now buzzed with wedding preparations, filled with the warmth of family found rather than born, proof that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. The late summer heat hung heavy over Redstone Ranch as Clara's labor pains began. Mrs. Dwyer quickly transformed the main bedroom into a birthing chamber, laying out clean linens and heating water while sending one of the hands to fetch Elijah from the north pasture. Hours passed as Clara labored, her courage never failing even as sweat dampened her hair. Mrs. Dwyer stayed close, her experienced hands steady and sure, murmuring encouragement through each contraction. Outside the bedroom door, Elijah paced like a caged wolf, his usual stoic demeanor cracking with every cry from within. As the lamp flames burned low, a new sound filled the ranch house, the strong, healthy wail of a newborn. Mrs. Dwyer's triumphant voice carried through the door. "A beautiful girl, strong as her mama." Elijah burst into the room, his breath catching at the sight of Clara cradling their daughter, both flushed but glowing with life. The baby's tiny fists waved in the lamplight as Clara pressed a gentle kiss to her dark hair. Small footsteps shuffled at the doorway as Mateo peered in, his eyes wide with wonder at the new arrival. He hesitated until Elijah beckoned him closer. "Come meet your sister, son," Elijah said softly. Mateo's face lit up at the word son, and for the first time the words tumbled from his lips. "Can I hold her, Pa?" The room grew still at this simple declaration of family. Elijah's throat tightened with emotion as he helped Mateo settle carefully beside Clara to see the baby. 3 days later, the ranch yard transformed into an outdoor chapel. Reverend Pike stood before a gathered crowd that would have seemed impossible months ago. Ranch hands in their Sunday best, Navajo traders in traditional dress, townspeople who'd made the long ride out. They all came together under the late summer sky to witness the christening. "We gather to welcome Hope Redstone into God's family," Reverend Pike announced, his voice carrying across the yard as he held the peaceful infant. The name rang true, Hope, born of love that had bridged cultures and healed old wounds. Clara stood proud beside Elijah, her hand tucked in his arm, while Mateo pressed close to his father's other side. As Reverend Pike completed the blessing, golden sunlight spilled over the ridge, illuminating the high pasture where the boundary dispute had once threatened everything. Elijah surveyed the scene, his land secure, his crew loyal, former enemies now guests at his daughter's christening, but his gaze returned to Clara, Mateo, and Tiny Hope, understanding with perfect clarity that his greatest victory had nothing to do with property or pride. God had given him a family to love and protect, a gift beyond any earthly possession. And if today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.